manager. We'll explain that later. As we use it, we'll explain it.
Sorry, what environment should we?
I'm sorry?
What environment?
Just my terminal. Just the terminal is where I just launched this.
Sublime?
No, I'm not using a text editor yet. This is just a terminal. So right here is what I'm running right there. And then Webpack is next. And then last but not least, install the Turbo CLI. If you've come to a previous demo, you've done this already, do it again, because I'm updating this CLI roughly twice a week or so. So it's almost constantly being updated. So go ahead and do it again. And the CLI is our liaison to our Turbo deployment environment. It's what enables us to deploy our code to our hosting environment, in addition to like a series of other things, but that's going to be the most important thing. Okay, everyone good with that? And then go ahead and sign up here. Like I said earlier, if you haven't already, go ahead and sign up. It is free. You can go all the way to the bottom if you want to sign up, down here. I'm going to log in, obviously, because I'm already signed up. So let me just log in. And when you log in, you should see something along these lines. You're not going to see all these projects, obviously, unless you have projects already. You should just get a series of instructions. So tonight we're going to make a very simple app where a user can sign up, log in, log out. It's going to maintain a session so you know what users are logged in and logged out. And then we're going to create a very simple React component to reflect who's logged in and who's logged out. Keep it simple. This is good. This will be appropriate for beginners to React. So newcomers to React, okay, rather than total beginners. Okay, so if you have some JavaScript background, HTML, CSS, you're in a good position for this. Everyone good? Okay, so whoops, sorry. Let me just. So CD to wherever you do your work. I'm going to do this on my desktop just because it's the easiest location for me. But wherever you do your development work, just change directory to that. Okay. And let's create our project. So here we're creating a project called Turbo New. Let's go with let's see here. So last time I started a project for like a job posting board where people who are looking for jobs can just find listings. I'm going to maintain that and basically continue that project. So we'll start that here, and we'll basically make a job board app, a very simple CRUD, what's called a CRUD application, where we're just posting some data, retrieving it, rendering it, very simple. Okay, so let's call it job search, and then here I'm specifying the React flag. So the Turbo CLI gives you a series of scaffolding options, one of which is React. And the React flag provides you a full stack React template with Redux installed. Now we're not going to use all the Redux stuff. We're just going to use the React stuff. But this quickly generates a React Redux project for you with a Node Express backend like instantly, so you can just get started right away. So this is one of the scaffolding options we're going to use. Okay, so go ahead and create that. Okay. And then cd into the project, so cd into the job search directory. Okay, since this is a Node project, we have to install the dependencies, what's called the npm modules. So that's done by just doing npm install. So right now we're installing the default dependencies of that project, which will give us all the tools and libraries we need to run the project. So these are like pip modules in Python. I do Python as well, so I do Python Django class. So I just picked up a new Python client today. So So if you're from a Ruby background, these would be like installing gems, pip modules, npm, and Node Express. The difference here, as far as pip is concerned, I don't know if you're the only Python, but I'll just explain it anyway, is that these modules are being installed locally rather than on your system. Right? So when you install pip modules, it gets installed into your system. Here, it's locally installed, which means when you remove the project, you remove all those libraries as well.
What are the warnings? Like, what do the warnings mean? Like, I'm having them all of the time as well. Like,
Oh, these deprecation warnings? It's not a big deal. Just basically need to upgrade library versions. Don't worry about it. So this takes about 1 minute to 2 minutes to install. So while that's going, let's create our project over on this side. So I already have it up here. I'm just going to delete this and start from scratch. So delete. Let's go ahead and create a project over here on our Turbo account so we have an environment to deploy to. Basically by doing this right here, job search. What we're doing is creating a hosting environment on the Turbo platform where we can deploy our project. That's pretty much what we're doing here. So go ahead and do that. And you can configure your options, right? Like set an image, put a description, things like that. Like pretty standard stuff. But what we need from this admin console is this guy right here, the app ID. Okay, this is our unique app identifier. So go ahead and copy that onto your clipboard. Just copy it. Okay. And by now, this should be done. So go back to your terminal and make sure you're looking at the same thing. Or, close to it. Okay? So now we want to connect our local project to our remote project. So we do turbo app. And we paste in the ID number like that. And that will connect our local source code to our remote project. It's kind of like connecting it to a GitHub repository. It's basically the same idea. So just go ahead and do that, and it's done. So now our local source code is connected to our remote Turbo, not repository, but our hosting environment, staging environment. So the next thing we want to do is turbo dev server. And you should see that. Okay, it's running a local server on 3000, port 3000. So head over to localhost 3000 and make sure you see what you're supposed to see. So here is the scaffolded project from Turbo. So it's a very simple front-end project. But this is a React Redux project. Be aware of that. So if you look at this icon right here, that means it's a React Redux project, or at least a React project. Okay, so this is a full stack React project scaffolded right off the bat. Okay, so that means everything worked. So go ahead and stop the server by doing Control-C. Okay, we want to do a quick deploy just to make sure everything works on your remote as well, your staging environment, and then we will start our process, our development. Okay, so next thing we want to do is turbo log in right there. And log in with the account that you signed up with just a minute ago. And then we do turbo deploy, and this will deploy our local project to our staging environment on Turbo so that we can make sure it works on the actual live environment as opposed to just local. Turbo will automatically assign you a staging URL where you can test your project files and make sure everything works on live versus local host. It is on the internet, so you can update the CNAME and point to your actual custom domain to a Turbo project. It's like Heroku, same idea.
so what was the last step?
Turbo deploy. Okay, deployment takes usually about 1 to 2 minutes, similar to Heroku. And once it's done, it'll give you the staging link, your custom URL for this project, which is right here. That's my staging link. So go ahead and copy that. enter it into your browser, and make sure you see the same thing, which you should. And there it is. And that means it worked. So you have your staging and your local, everything's good to go, everything is synced up. We're now ready to begin programming. So give me a thumbs up if you have this working on your end. All right, so that's a quick from scratch scaffold to deploy. Okay, that means everything works, and now we're ready to begin our programming process. Good. So head back here and run the dev server again. So Turbo dev server, and let's begin programming. So here is our project, or here's my project right here. So open this up in Sublime or Atom or whatever you prefer. Okay, so the important takeaway here is that you're looking at a Node Express project with React already integrated. So this is a very standard Node Express architecture. When you go to localhost 3000, what you're looking at literally is the index.mustache file in the views directory. So if you open that up, the views directory, right here, we have our index.mustache right here. Mustache is a templating engine that allows us to inject data dynamically into HTML forms, HTML files. Right, so here we're using Mustache, which is pretty standard. And there's also handlebars and Jade, stuff like that. I like Mustache. So here is the actual HTML we're looking at, the intro page. However, you may notice there's not very much there. There's only 15 lines. So how does this 15 lines end up looking like that? Right? That happens through React. So the way React works is that it's what's called the client-side. It does client-side rendering. So what that means is the actual visual content doesn't load until the page loads first. So the page itself loads first, and then React will inject the UI. That's called client-side rendering. Okay, so it's very imperceptible, but if you look very closely, this is for a split second. It's a blank screen, and then it shows up. That's the client-side render. Okay, so what React does, the React code in this line, in this file, particularly are lines 12 and 13. That's our React bundle. Okay, what it does is it finds the div with that ID called root, and then it injects the UI that we specify into that div. So that div gets populated. So if you actually look at the source code like that, you will see that we have a root that's empty. There's nothing in there. You see that? But we're looking at a lot more visual content. Like it seems like a paradox. Like how's there nothing here, but we see so much HTML? If you actually look at the inspect element, look at the root now. It has all that stuff inside. You see that? That's React doing its thing. It's injecting its content into the root. Okay, that's client-side rendering. Angular 1 does the same. So that's how it works. That's the flow, right? So what that means is, where do we define the content for the root? That happens inside this src directory. This src directory right here is where all the React code resides. Okay, so all the React code is generated inside here. Specifically, I should leave it over on this side. Specifically, this index.js inside the src is your entry point for the React project. So if you open that up, this is React, right? And here's where we tell the root what content to render. Okay, literally render. And inside here, we're rendering the intro, what's called a component, which is basically a block of HTML. Okay, a component is like a block of HTML that you can reuse anywhere in your React project. This intro component is from right here, line 5, which is inside the components directory. So if you look at the components directory, you will find an intro component. And here you will see the HTML that looks more like what we're looking at on the home page. Right? So here it says welcome to Turbo. You see that, line 10? Right? That is the actual visual content that shows up here. Right? And that's the flow of React. That's how React works. Right? So inside here, we can change all this content to make it look the way we want on the intro page, or we can do what's more typical, is create entirely new components and render those in the React entry point. Okay, that's what we're going to do tonight. All right, so if we go back to our React entry point, let's get rid of this explainer text. I'm not going to just get into the provider other than to say it's a Redux concept. We're not going to do any Redux tonight, so let's get rid of that. Okay, and instead we're going to render just that very minimal content. Also, since we're not going to use the intro, let's go ahead and just comment that out, get rid of it. Okay? So, again, I assume everyone in this room has some HTML understanding, right? So obviously we're just rendering some very primitive HTML. I think we can understand that, right? So, if I have my dev server running still and I reload the page, you're going to see no change. It's the same thing, right? That's because React is a compiled library. What that means is we have to recompile the code in order to commit the changes. Okay? So we have to redefine the bundle, or actually recreate the bundle. So the question then becomes, how do you do that? We do that through what's called Webpack. So if we open this up over here, and we do Command-T to open another tab. Okay? What we want to do right now is run Webpack. And this will recompile our React code and recreate the bundle files. Okay? So now we're significantly moving away from conventional web development like Ruby on Rails and Django. They do not do it this way. This is a very typical, unique to React concept. So here, I recompiled the code and I recreated the React bundle. So what that means is I can now reload the page and I should see the changes now. Does that make sense? In particular, if you go back to your index.mustache, we recreated these two files, lines 12 and 13. Those are called the bundle. Okay? This is where your React code eventually ends up. It all ends up over here. Okay? Specifically line 13. But lines 12 and 13 combined constitute your React code. And you have to recompile them every time you make changes. Okay? And again, that's called your bundle. And inside this bundle is where you define what shows up in the React code. That's how React fundamentally works. Okay? So, now we're seeing what we're supposed to be seeing over here. Or at least I am. So by a show of thumbs up, thumbs down, who else is seeing the same thing?
Can I see the Webpack?
Sure. The Webpack command? Yes. So you want to open another tab and run Webpack. This is the command up here. It's just literally Webpack. So give me a thumbs up, thumbs down again. I didn't catch all of that. Okay, so good.
Sorry, when I open another terminal.
Command T, and then you want to run that command over there, Webpack.
No, when I kick you out of job search.
Oh, you want to change directory back into the root level of job search. CD into, like, literally C. So let's say I'm in the same spot as you. I'm no longer in the right directory. I do CD job search. Okay, so you want to get used to that process. So basically the idea is you make changes in React, you do your React code, it recompiles, and then you reload. That's how it works, that's how React goes. Okay? So here, like I was saying a few moments ago, we really want to create a series of components and reuse these components. Although this is valid React, it's certainly not good React. We want to create components to render this content. So right now we want to create a component. So if you look at the directory structure of the React project, we have src and then components and then containers and intro, right? So we want to be inside the components directory and create a component in here to render over here, okay? So right now we want to cd into the src and then cd into the components directory And let's create a component called, let's see what's going to happen on this one. Let's have this component load a job feed, a feed of actual job postings, right? So let's call it feed. Okay, so this component will eventually render a listing of jobs based on your location or search criteria, tech jobs versus design jobs, whatever, okay? That's going to be eventually what shows up here. Always CD back to your root level. It's very easy to forget that, and that can often lead to a lot of mistakes and bugs. And let's go into our feed.js right here and create our first React component. So it should be empty, obviously we just created it. So we need to import React. I'll explain all this, don't worry about it. I'm just sort of setting things up first and then I'll explain. So don't feel like, you should know all this. All right, so here on line 1, we're importing the React library, the entire library, as well as the sub-module called component. On line 3, we define our component called feed. A component, like I said earlier, you can think of as a block of HTML. Okay, and in this case, that block of HTML are lines 7, 8, and 9. I think that's pretty. You can kind of see that. So wherever we use the feed component, that HTML is what shows up. Okay, does that make sense? And then, whoops, I did not mean to do that. So now we want to, let's use it. Let's go ahead and use the component. So go back to our index here, our React index. And instead of intro, let's import the feed component. Okay, so we imported the feed component. Let's get rid of this over here. And let's use our feed component. So it's kind of like defining custom HTML tags, kind of, right? And instead, we're going to see the HTML inside the feed component. Now, again, if we reload the app right now, it's not going to change, right? Because we've got to run Webpack, right? Don't forget to recompile. Obviously, that can get a little tedious to run Webpack over and over and over again. So really what you want to do is run it with a watch flag like that and just leave it open. That way, it'll recompile every time you make changes. It'll just automatically recompile, okay? So now if I check my local host, I see the updated component. You guys see that? Good. Thumbs up, thumbs down, usual. Okay, so if you don't have it working, let's debug. I'm going to pause the video for that, and let's track down these bugs. Okay, great. So now I'm going to create another component which will actually render the list of jobs. Okay, the reason I'm going to do that, well, actually let me just do it this way first. So let's do it this way. H3, current jobs. Let's do an ordered list on this. And inside this ordered list, yeah, let's go with the ordered list. Let's do so here I'm creating a couple sample jobs. So let's go with graphic designer. Need someone to create a logo. Let's do a couple more sample jobs. So, programmer, need someone to create my startup site. And marketer, need someone to promote. Couple sample jobs, obviously very basic. So we'll just roll with this for now. So this time I have Webpack watching the files, right? So I don't have to like remember to reload it every time. So I should be able to just reload and see these things show up. That's it. Good? So now it's a little bit more like a regular like programming flow. Just make your changes, reload. Alrighty. I'm going to put this in the class right here called container because I'm using a bootstrap class, which gives me some padding. You may notice I'm calling it class name instead of class because in React, or specifically what's called JSX, this is JSX code. This is not JavaScript. It's called JSX. In JSX, we have certain keywords and phrases that we have to use in lieu of other ones. So we can't use the word class. We have to use the word class name. It's just a JSX rule. So just give me some padding, that's all. Okay, so then here, let's give it some padding in here. So the reason I'm doing this is to show you how to do some styling in JSX. So again, keep in mind, we're not doing HTML. It looks like HTML. It's very close to HTML, but it's not exactly HTML. It's JSX, which has its own subset of rules that are a little bit different. And this is another one. This is how you do styling in JSX, okay? And the 16 is by default pixels. Okay, so that's the default unit of measurement. So I'm giving a padding of 16. I'm going to give it a background color of light gray. That's a background color of light gray. So it still uses the HTML hex codes and the usual stuff. Notice, by the way, it's a comma rather than a semicolon, right? Because in regular HTML styling, we would use a semicolon, right? So that's another minor distinction. It's very, very easy to forget, and it can cause a lot of headaches when you're debugging. Okay? And then, what's the last one? Let's do a border.
Does it matter if it's single quotes or double quotes?
No, it doesn't matter. Okay, so here, I'm applying a border to that div just to distinguish it from the other divs. Okay? So again, Webpack should be watching, which means I can just reload it like that, and I see that change right here. Right? You guys see that? So it worked on my end, which means we can apply the same style to all three divs and save it, and then hopefully they all look that way, right? Now, if you're coming from an HTML CSS background, you can probably already tell it really shouldn't be like this. What would be a better way to handle this? Yeah, CSS class, right? A class for CSS. Now, we don't exactly create a class, but we do a similar concept by creating a style attribute all the way down here. Let's do style object really, so const style. And here we can define style like broader styles. So let's say I don't know, job post like that. And these are just objects, like JSON objects. So we can just copy the objects from here. Right, and then we can apply this style to all the divs, which would be a better way to handle that. And also, I'm going to give it a margin. Let's give it margin bottom of 24. Okay, notice how on line 40 I'm applying a margin bottom, which in conventional CSS is margin hyphen bottom, but here we use camel case. That's another JSX rule. Okay, so JSX has a lot of like nuances that you just have to learn over time, but through repetition. Okay, it's very like detail oriented, and unlike HTML CSS, where if you make a mistake, it'll still run, and it'll still, for the most part, try to make it look right. JSX won't even do that. It'll just crash. Okay, it'll just be like, nope, not doing it. Get it right next time. So I'll show you how that looks in a second. But right here, we can now use the style object like that. You see that? It's kind of like a CSS class. Okay. Notice, by the way, how it's a single curly brace instead of a double curly brace this time. Make sure you catch that difference. It's a very important distinction. Okay. There are logical reasons for this, but just for now, just understand that's how it's supposed to work. Okay. So we can apply that everywhere. Now that's kind of the whole point, right? So here we go right here. So now they're all referencing the same JSON object, style object, and it should apply all the way through. So if I reload this time, I get that. How's it looking on your end? Okay. I'm going to create, this is already using Bootstrap because we're using a Bootstrap class. So I'm going to create a column grid structure here. I'm going to have the jobs on the left side and a sign up / login form on the right side. Kind of like the Reddit feed layout. It's going to be a similar idea. So let's go ahead and do that. Oh, actually no. Before I do that, I want to deliberately induce a mistake so you see how that looks. Do not follow me for this. Okay. So I'm going to make a mistake on purpose so you understand what to look out for. So here, let's say I forget this is JSX and I sort of revert back into CSS mode and I do this, right? I do this all the time, very typical mistake, right? So what you want to do is you always want to check in on Webpack. Webpack is kind of like your permission slip. Like nothing will happen unless Webpack works. So if you look at my Webpack right now, it should have crashed, right? Obviously red is bad. So right here, this crash I just induced by that mistake right there, and then it tries to help you out. It usually gives you pretty readable error messages saying like that's where you messed up. So what you really want to do is start developing the habit of just checking back in on Webpack, like roughly every 2 minutes or so. Like just check back in, because what tends to happen to beginners, and this definitely happened to me a lot when I was starting out, was I would just forget to check Webpack for like an hour, and I may have made a mistake on minute 4. And I programmed for another 56 minutes, right? So if you do that, finding that mistake in minute 4 is insanely difficult. Just don't do that to yourself. Just check all the time. Don't let more than 3, 4, 5 minutes go by and be like, oh, it's been a while since I checked Webpack. Let me just make sure I didn't mess anything up. Okay? It's a habit you want to develop, but no matter what, if you stick with React, you will develop it. Like it's just going to happen anyway, but you want to think of it ahead of time. So let's go ahead and fix that guy. And that puts us back in business. And now Webpack gives me green, what we want. Okay? So now let's go back and do what I was going to do a minute ago. Let's create a, let's see here. Over here, let's create the column grid structure I was saying earlier. So we're using Bootstrap, right? So we can just go ahead and set up that row, just like conventional Bootstrap. I'm going to put 2 columns, right? So 1, 2. We're going to do col MD8. We're going to do 8 and 4. Okay. And we're going to put the actual listing of jobs in here and the sign up login form in here. Okay. So that listing of jobs we had a minute ago, let's grab all of that and put it right there. Okay. So maybe a little hard to see, but I'm just moving chunks of HTML around. That's all I'm doing. So I put all the jobs in here. Okay. And then on the right side, it's empty for now, but it'll eventually be a sign up form. So if I reload this now, the only difference is going to be that these rows will just be narrower. That's it. It should cut off right around here. Okay. So hopefully that's what happens. And there it is, right there. Give me the room I need on the right side to create a sign-up form. Okay, that was a little fast, but I was just moving HTML around, so I would imagine.
Could you scroll up a little bit?
Yeah. Okay, we'll worry about the sign-up form when it comes time to get to it, but I just want to leave that prepared for when we get to it. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay. Yeah, looks pretty good. Okay, so really what we want to do is store this listing of jobs in its own component. So you're really nesting a lot of components in React. Like this is something you need to sort of get used to. Like you want to think as modular as you can. So even this is not very good architecture. It's closer than before, but we want to get even these inside their own component. So here's how you want to think of it. This is the distinction that you want to think of. This data right here, these jobs, the graphic designer, the computer programmer, the marketer, where is that data going to come from? Literally, how are we going to retrieve this data? Like we're not going to code it in here, right? It's not going to just stay here. So what were you saying?
User backend.
A backend, exactly. A database, a backend. It's going to come from some dynamic source of information, a database, a backend, a REST API, whatever. So whenever there's data that's being rendered that should come from a backend, that data typically belongs in what's called a container. Okay? So right here, you may have noticed that we have a subdirectory by default called containers. That's why it's there. Okay? So in other words, this data right here, for the most part, belongs in a container. Traditionally speaking, it belongs in a container. So what we want to do is set up a container to render this data. So we're going to do that next right now. Okay? But does that thought process make sense? It's important to understand how to make these distinctions. So let's go back here. Whoops, didn't mean to turn that off. cd to the src, the components, and then the containers. This time we're in the containers, so make sure you catch that, right? Okay, and let's create a container called jobs. Okay, and don't forget to change directory back to the root. So that's kind of where you always want to be, is in the root. So just go back to the root wherever you're done, wherever you are. And let's open up the jobs container right here. And let's set up a simple component again. Right, so now we're inside the jobs container. Right? And for now, we're going to do pretty much the exact same thing as before. Set up a very, very simple component that does fundamentally nothing, but we're just making sure it works, right? So let's go ahead and set it up. Jobs container. Okay, so just like before, like an extremely primitive component, just to make sure that the rendering is accurate. Okay, and then this time I'm going to do something slightly different. It's not major. You don't really even have to do it, but it makes it more convenient. If you look at the containers directory, there's also another index file in there. You see that? Open that guy up. and we are going to export the jobs container like that, okay? This is more of a convenience thing. You don't really have to do it. It makes it easier to export multiple components though. So you can imagine in a more robust project, you're going to have like a lot of containers. You know, typical project for me is maybe 15 containers. This makes it easy to export like all 15. It's just a convenient way to get them all out of the way. Okay? So now going back to the feed component, we now want to import the jobs component and render that instead. So let's go ahead and do exactly that. So import jobs from notice how it's in braces like that. That's because we're importing it from the index file of the containers library. So if I want to import like 10 containers from that one directory, I just stack them inside those parentheses, those curly braces, that's all, rather than have 15 separate lines. And now we're going to render the jobs component here, right, just like we did before, right? But we want to get rid of all the other jobs that we had there earlier. Just cut them. Right? We want to render that instead. Now bringing this down to like really where it should be, like a very simple layout structure, and that's it. So normally when I add new files and components, I completely rerun Webpack. The reason is because Webpack is only watching the files that existed when you ran Webpack. So if you create a new one, it doesn't know about it. So I just rerun. That's a nice little like gotcha that tripped me up for a long time. So and then run your dev server, Turbo dev server. Here is the jobs container, very good. So now we've successfully confirmed that the container is showing up. Now we can take all that previous content and just shove it in the container. So we go back here, and we just paste in the content we had before, just restoring it, okay? So if you think about it, this is just fancy moving HTML around, right? That's really all we're doing. We're just moving HTML around.
What about the style?
Oh, great catch. Thank you. So, I'm sorry, what was your name?
Danny.
How do you say that?
Danny.
Danny. So Danny said we forgot the style. He's correct. So copy that and paste it into your jobs container like that. Which also, by the way, means we don't need it in the feed. So we can just remove it. Now we're back to where we were before. It looks exactly the same, so it looks like we didn't make any progress, but we actually made a fair amount of progress. We organized our components much more effectively in a much better architecture. Architecture in React Redux projects is a huge issue. It's one of the biggest reasons I get assignments on a contract basis, because a lot of the architecture is often like poorly designed. It just doesn't follow best practice. So you really want to understand the architecture. It's very, very important. So here we have what we had before, but better architecture. So now what we want is inside the jobs container. So again, this is still static data, right? It's not really dynamic. It's supposed to come from the back end. So this component will retrieve data from our back end, the jobs, and render that data rather than just this static data right here. Make sense? So let's start the process, the mechanisms through which that's going to happen. So right now, turn off all your components. We want to swing back to the back end and set up a REST API where we can create jobs and then access those jobs. Does anyone here not know what a REST API is? Okay, Ruby on Rails strongly emphasizes REST API, so it's a pretty standard concept. So we want to make a very simple REST API where you can create a job and then access and retrieve those jobs. Very simple. So what we're doing now is moving away from React and going to the Node Express backend to do that. So let's go ahead and open up the routes. Inside the routes file, we have an API file, api.js. That's a sample API route that comes with the scaffold. So we can just go ahead and use this to create our data. So what we're going to do is create a post handler. So let's copy this guy right here. So just copy that, line 7 through 13, paste it down here. And instead of a get, we're going to set it up as a post. Okay. This is called a URL parameter. We're not going to use that. We're going to just call it job. And for now, this post handler will simply return the data from the post request. But we're not going to actually persist it yet. We're just going to confirm that it works. So right now what we're going to do is just send the data back pretty much literally as is. Let's call it body. So in other words, when we send a post request, the post parameters will be packaged inside the rec.body, and this post handler will just spit it right back to us. That's all it's going to do. It's just like boomerang it right back, just so that we can make sure the data is accurate. Okay? Does that make sense? So now the question is, how do we do that? So we have to set up a form, a post form, upon which we can do that. We can literally do that. So what we're going to do right now is head over to our views directory right here, right there. We're going to create another view for creating jobs. Okay, sort of like an admin console where you can add jobs. Let's go ahead and do that. So head over to the views directory. Let's call it add job, I guess. Okay, don't forget now, this is just regular Node Express, so it's the mustache file. It's not a component. So we want to do add job.mustache. So we're just creating a new page, is really what I'm saying. We just created a new page called add job. So far, so good. Open up your index mustache and copy and paste. Oops, that'll come back in a second. Copy and paste all of this inside the add job.mustache. Okay. This will not be a React UI. This is just going to be regular HTML, CSS. So we don't need this. These two lines right here, get rid of them. Okay, we don't need the root. This is not going to be a React module. So all we're doing is setting up very, very standard HTML, CSS. And we're going to set up a post form for the purposes of adding a job. Name, I think that's what we need. Name, title, placeholder. Right. And description. Okay, obviously this is a very, very basic job form. You're going to want to add a lot more in a real project, but I think we can just work with this for now. Normally I would add a lot more, like what's the company, give me an image if you have one, pay rate, the pay range, things like that.
How you spell this placeholder wrong?
Thank you, thank you. Okay. All right, so now what we want to do, well, first things first, let's get this guy even just showing up. Like, let's make sure we can see this. So how do we do that? So going back to our routes, this index route right here, the index route right here, this is the primary route that renders pages. So in there is where we dictate the logic to show pages, right? So if we open that up, all this other stuff, just get rid of it because these are just samples, so don't worry about the samples. Examples are a better way to put it. So I just got rid of all the examples except the first one because that is the home page route. So this is the route that renders the home page, right, our actual React UI. But now we want to set up another route to render the add job page. Let's go with that. Okay. That's it. That's all I gotta do. So we don't need to inject any data, nothing like that. It's as simple as that. So this render command will render the add job mustache file from the views directory. That's the connection here. Okay. So this line of text on line 10 is where we determine what file to render. All right. So if we go back here, go back to your root level. Oh, wrong command. Turbo Dev Server. Here is the home page route, the original route. We now have an add job route showing the form we had before. So that's ready to go. That means we can now add jobs. Okay. Same as before, I'm going to just throw in a container class because I just don't like the way that looks. So that would be right here. Right, but remember, now we're doing regular HTML, CSS, right? So it's not class name. Now we're back to just regular HTML, CSS. All right? So now this right here, line 8, is the form that will send the data to the add job API endpoint. So that then the question is, how do we do that? So we have an API endpoint. Now all forms should send posts. You probably already know that. So create it as post. Right? And that's why this is post right here. That's why, that's the connection between the two. The endpoint right here on line 24 is /API/job. Right? That's the endpoint we set up here. So that's called the action in a form. /API/job. So this will direct this data to the API endpoint that we wrote about 5-10 minutes ago. Okay, so if it was successful, if it worked, it'll just spit it right back to us. It'll just take the data and send it right back. Okay, that's how we know it worked. Okay, so let's test it out. So reload this first job, this job. Thanks for coming. Okay, so here's the first job. You see that? Good. Just spit it right back out. Does that make sense? Okay. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Who has this working? Oh, almost everyone. Good. All right. Okay, so here it is right here, right? So let's get rid of this. So what we've done is we've confirmed that the data is accurate. Right? We have the correct data. So now we want to persist it. We want to actually put it into the database. We're not going to set up Postgres. We're not going to set up SQL, all that stuff. We're just going to use the Turbo, what's called the Turbo Datastore. Okay, so here, if you look on line 1, Turbo, that is our SDK connection to our Turbo environment. We can persist data onto Turbo just for free. So what we do here is we Turbo create Thanks for coming. Okay. So here, oh, I forgot one thing. Rec.body. Rec.body. You know, I normally don't comment when people leave, but every time people leave, I'm just thinking like, this is programming, guys. This is it. This is how it goes. And if you can't handle it, then don't be a programmer. Like, I do this for free. There's a lot of good value here. I'll keep on doing it. If you want to be a programmer, this is it. This is easy to me. This is easy. So if you want to be a professional programmer, stick with it. Stick with it. Anyway, so here we're creating a job on the Turbo Datastore. Okay, now this is a bit of a, how can I put it? I'm not going to say new, but it's like an evolving concept in JavaScript. This is called a promise. Okay, so now in JavaScript, normally what you do is you have completion handlers. That's actually what we're doing right here on line 24. This is a completion handler. But here, a promise is kind of like a more sequential completion handler. It's like an easier way of dealing with completion handlers. So here, when we create the job, we pass in our body, our rec.body from the form. And then this block of text right here, 27 through 31, that's your successful completion callback. Okay? And then here is the error. So we're not going to worry about this for now because we're going to just assume it works. But we should handle an error if something goes wrong. So basically right here on line 33 is where we say, in case something goes wrong, this is what we do. Okay? So, right here on line 30, we don't want to send the body back because this is the data from the form. We already know that worked. What we want to do is send the data back from the data store. Okay, this right here on line 27 is called the payload. So what this means is that, like if it worked, the response, I guess, will be in here. Okay? So I'm going to hold off on this for now, but we really shouldn't leave it like that. So I'm going to just test it real quick. So let's go ahead and test this. First job. This is the first job. So now we're getting the data back, but notice how there's more stuff. Right, it's a little bit more data. That's because it's not from the form, it's from the service, it's from the database. It's very important to understand. So here, if you go back to your Turbo Admin Console and click on Datastore, and then click on this, well, I should reload first, excuse me. Look it over here, you see? There's now a new data schema called job. So if I click on that, it'll show the job I just created. It's persisted, so it's there forever. We can now reference jobs in the data store. Does that make sense?
No, I don't know that.
Okay, so let's make sure you have this right here. Now, while we're here, I'm just gonna button this up because this is not good. So, in case something goes wrong, we really should send back a response that says fail. This likely won't happen tonight, or if ever, but just in case, we should cover it.
How do you know what to name it, like data or message or whatever?
Well, give me which lines.
I mean, like line 36 and line 30. Like.
So line 30, let's do it one at a time. So line 30, we don't really have a choice because the callback is called data.
Okay.
That comes from the service, right? So we have to call it data over here. Okay. Over here, this one right
Yeah.
here, we can call it whatever we want to. So we can call it payload, we can call it confirmation call. That's whatever we want to call it. But this one right here has to be data. Okay. Error, same concept. You see how this is the callback from the service? Now in JavaScript, the error object typically has a message key, like 95%. So I'm referencing that knowledge. Okay? They should have a message key, but however, sometimes they don't. So when that happens, I do like, oops. I have to put in my own message, like something went wrong. Right? Something went wrong. Unfortunately, I can't give you more detail than that because the error message key doesn't exist. So in other words, I don't have more detail than that. However, like 95% like this will work. So, all right, how are we doing? So I'm going to create a couple more jobs just to have some sample jobs, right? So let's go back here. Are you good?
Yeah.
Okay. So instead of first job, second job, let's create actual jobs. So let's see here. Designer. Need designer for my website. Okay, so we got that. I'm gonna create.
I don't have like the timestamped ID.
Yeah. Okay. So what you probably forgot, or maybe I just went too fast, is right here. You might still have rec.body on line 30.
For data?
Correct.
I have data.data. And rec.body like in the turbo.create.
No, because you have date.
Oh, alright, I'm good.
Yep. Let's do one or two more. So designer. Let's see here. Let's just go programmer. Programmer. I need an iPhone. Programmer. Let's see what else. Programmer, designer. I don't know. Social network marketer. Social network marketer. Manage my Facebook and Instagram accounts. Okay, so we have some fake jobs now. Let's see here. Okay, now that we can create jobs, the question is how do we retrieve them? Before we actually get onto that, let's just make sure they show up over here. Right, so here's the Turbo Datastore, and if I click on the data store over here and click on jobs again, I just want to make sure I see all the jobs I just created. Okay, it's a quick way to confirm that the data has been persisted. Okay, with the accurate attributes. And if you make a mistake, you can edit it here. You can delete it, do whatever you want here. Okay, how are we doing? Thumbs up, thumbs down. We're waiting on 2. All right. Equally important is how do we retrieve this data now? Right, we have it. How do we get it on the on the project side? So what we want to do now is set up a GET request for jobs. Does that make sense? So here we have a sample GET request on line 7 for me. Or
Sorry, put an S on there. I think it's on job.
thanks. So here we have a sample GET request right there. Right? Well, let's not use that. Let's copy that and create a specific request, API request for retrieving jobs. And this API request will simply retrieve all the jobs. That's it. So we do turbo. So again, it's a turbo SDK command. So we do turbo fetch job, pass in null for query params. It's the same idea here. It returns a promise. So the promise sequence is pretty much identical. So we could actually even just copy and paste it.
Catches always for error, right?
Correct. Think of the word catch as like, in case something goes wrong, do this. That's essentially, that's what it is. And then here is a success block. So JavaScript is kind of weird the way you read it. You know, it's mostly asynchronous, and this is actually one significant departure from Python. Like Python is very synchronous, line by line by line. It's literally synchronous code. Here, it's not like, you don't think of it as like this happens, then that happens, and that happens. That is not the way you read this. It's this happens, and that's done. That's where it finishes. This may or may not happen, and like it probably won't happen. That's how you think of it. Okay, so you kind of have to read things like inside out. It took me a while to use that, but that's like all of JavaScript. So you'll just get used to it more and more you do. Okay. So
You
here,
have like multiple thens.
Absolutely.
And then you always have the catch
at the end, that's exactly how it works. That's the fundamental benefit of promises. Now, completion handlers, you can't do that, so you just go inside more and more and more, call it like the triangle of doom or something. And if you have like more than 2 completion blocks, it becomes a big hairy mess. It becomes a nightmare to maintain. But if with a promise, you just have then, that's it. So here, if I go localhost API / job, right? That's the route we just made. Here are the jobs I just created on my backend. Obviously on yours, it should be your jobs. Good? So now we have a way of creating data and fetching data. Obviously that's like the most important part, right? Now we can leverage these mechanisms inside of React code. So who has this working? Because this is the most important part. Okay, so we're done with that. So we're done with the back end, at least for now. We might go back to it later. But what we're doing is we're switching back and forth, front end, back end, front end, back end. So normally what I do when I do that, it's like a context switch. You see how I turn everything off and I just sort of restart, like I'm switching my brain over the front end. You kind of want to think of it that way. Otherwise, it's very, very easy to confuse the two. And that's where mistakes happen, right? So you want to go back and forth. So here, I'm now going back to the jobs container, right? Because here is where that dynamic data is supposed to show up, right? So here's where we're going to leverage that API call. So see it right now. So what we want to do is set up what's called the state. I guess jobs, let's go with that. Okay. Okay, so basically the state, every component has a state where you can maintain data that's pertinent to that component, okay, that pertains to that component. So this component obviously cares about jobs, right, obviously. So we want to set up a state where we can maintain the data for those jobs and then render them over here. So we're still going to use this static data inside the state for now. So let's go ahead and set up a couple objects. Description, right? Description. Test. This is a test job. This job 2. Okay, because this is going to be very temporary, I'm just setting up a very simple dummy jobs for now. And we're going to render these instead of these. Make sure that works. So, don't forget this comma right here. Very, very easy to overlook. Right there. So, instead of these over here, let's get rid of those. What we're going to do is we're going to do what's called map. We're going to map over that list of jobs and then render the list item for each one, right? So this dot state jobs dot map job Whoa, sorry. Let's see right here. So I copied and pasted this from before. Like I didn't just write all that code, right? I just copied one of the previous items and pasted it in right here, right? So that's like the easiest way to manage that. Oh, this is a mistake right there. That should be plural. Jobs. Okay, make sure you catch that. That was a mistake I just made. So plural. I mean, I would imagine this is pretty intuitive, right? Like we're just mapping through every job in the array, and that is a direct reference to the specific job. So we can grab the data from there and render it in here. So instead of a hard-coded title, what we do is job.title right here, and then job.description, right? Like that. So spell it right. So for now, this should render the jobs from the hard-coded jobs in the state, those 2 test jobs, and that's it. So test 1, test 2, we're good on that. So make sure you have that, because once you do, we've essentially set it up to retrieve data from the API. Okay, don't worry about this key attribute. I'll explain it later, but for now, just understand you have to do it. Unless you already know, which is fine. So. All right, how's this working out for you guys? Is it working? Yep. Okay. So what's important to understand here is that this content right here, lines 21 through 28 or so, give or take, this block of code will automatically reflect whatever is inside this array. So if I make a change to this array, this block of code will automatically reflect the changes. You don't have to like rewrite any rendering, right? So if this array changes, this block of code will react to those changes. Okay, hence the name React. So what we want to do is make an API request and then take the data and change that array, which will then create the corresponding reaction down here. Does that make sense? So if I get rid of these 2, everyone do that. Just comment these out. Okay. So it's empty because the array is empty, right? So the idea to understand here is that the UI will just react to changes in the array. That's what it does. That's how React works. So what we want to do now is make a request to the API, get the data, change the array. So we're going to do that using a module, a library called superagent. So npm superagent, like that. Superagent will make the request on our behalf. Okay, it's an HTTP library that just makes requests. It's very, very simple. It just makes HTTP requests. Alrighty. So once you have that installed, we need to import it in the component. And we can use that library to make requests. Okay, just installing a library, pretty straightforward. Now, the question is, when do we make that request? Like, when does that request literally get invoked? So, if you think about it, when we load the page and the array is empty, right here, I'm sorry, the server's off. Right here, Turbo Dev Server. Right here is where we need the jobs. Like as soon as the page shows up. Okay? So right here, we want to make that request like almost immediately, basically as soon as possible, so there's not a blank page for too long. Right? So what we want to do is make a request right when the component shows up. The way we do that is by overriding what's called a lifecycle method. Has anyone here not heard of that? Okay, so basically, React gives you a series of lifecycle methods that we can override where we can trigger our own functions. So what we're going to do is override the component did mount. So this is a lifecycle method that will get triggered as soon as the component shows up or mounts in the wording of React, in the vocabulary of React. So as soon as the component mounts, that function will be called, and then we can do whatever we need to. So for now, we're just doing a console log. So if we open the debugger and reload the app, we'll see the component did mount right there, right? So right at that split moment, we can make our API request and then retrieve the data. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. You guys got that working? Yeah, good. So we do super agent, and then we create our get request. Set. Let's put that. Okay, this isn't as much as it looks like. Basically, the only lines that matter are really 18 and 21. Everything else is just sort of filler text. You can just ignore it, really. Like, put it in there, but you don't have to worry about it. What matters on line 18, notice the URL here, /API/job. It's pointing to the endpoint we wrote about 10 minutes ago, right? And that's the endpoint that we wrote to retrieve the jobs from our database. Remember that? We tested it. So we're just hitting that endpoint now. This is going to make the request, and then the response will be right there. Hopefully it's successful. But if there's an error, we have to catch the error. Okay? So here, like I said, if there's an error, we catch it. Just throw some sort of alert, just some sort of notification saying something went wrong. If it's successful, it returns the data in a body key right here. That's a super agent API. The super agent returns the data, the payload, inside the body key. Okay, so this should happen as soon as the page loads. It's supposed to, but hopefully it works. Which means if so, we then have the data we need right here. Right, this is line 28 or 27. Line 27 at the current juncture is the most important line of this project. It has all the data we need from our backend. So if we reload, right there, and that's from our backend. Good. And you can kind of see like the job, timestamp, ID, description, et cetera, et cetera. What matters is right here, confirmation success, and then the data key is the payload. We need to parse out that key. That's the data we actually need. You guys with me on that? So here, I'm going to do const jobs. So all I've done is I've parsed one level deeper. You see that? I'm sorry, that's wrong. I just made a very mistake I said not to make. It should be that, the data key. Which is why I emphasized it so strongly just now. Make sure you get the right key. And that is your array of jobs. With me? So if I reload this time, I will not see that confirmation. I should just see an array, and that's it. Okay, that's literally the data I want. Good? So what we want to do now is grab that array and insert that data into here. Because remember what I said about 10 minutes ago, whatever the array is over here is what gets rendered in the component. The component will react to changes in state. Right? Again, that's the fundamental defining characteristic of React. Okay? So that's what makes React what it is. So here, what we want to do is reset the state. That's it. It's that simple. We just reassign the state with the data from the API.
Can you scroll like up a little bit? I'm constantly getting like I see what I did.
Yeah. So this time when I reload, assuming I didn't make any mistakes, I should see the job show up right there. Right there. From the backend, from our data store. So first job, designer, this is from our data store. So if I go back here, let's add another one. Let's see, what else is it? Product
manager, made PM for my app.
All right, so I'm going to create that here. So it's successful, right? That's the success callback. And then if I reload, there it is. Does that make sense?
Can you go back to the code real quick?
Yeah. So now we're getting into the areas where it's very React specific. Right? These concepts are uniquely React. Actually, Vue does the same thing, but Vue doesn't have React's critical mass. So this is what makes React React. So you won't find this in Angular, or at least Angular 1. You won't find this in like a Python Django module. Like you won't find this in most other current web stack environments. Certainly not PHP or Ruby on Rails. So we're now getting to a point where we're dealing with what makes React what it is. Does that make sense? How are we doing? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay, good ratio. So I'm going to make a few more changes for the sake of proper architecture. So remember I said about an hour ago, you want to modularize your components as much as you can. This is still not modular enough. All right, so what we want to do is take these lines 40 through 44 right here. These should be their own component, right? So here, specifically this div, to be honest, should be its own component, like that, right? So what we want to do is create another component whose only job is to render this, okay? So let's go ahead and do that. So cd to the src, components. Now the reason I'm pointing this out, it seems like, it might seem a little nitpicky, but the reason I'm pointing it out is to distinguish different kinds of components, right? This is not a container component. This is a simpler component. It's called a presentation component, right? Because it only renders data. It doesn't make any query requests. It doesn't actually hit the back end. It doesn't even have state, right? It just renders data. So what we want to do is create really a whole new directory. Let's call it presentation. So everyone do that. CD into it. Good. Let's call it preview. Because the idea is that it should be like a preview for a job that you can click on to get more information. It's kind of like that. So now the preview component is the simplest kind of component we're going to make pretty much in all of React. It's literally just like glorified HTML and that's it. It's just going to render data. Okay. So if we open up the preview presentation component, import React. So this component is so simple, it's not even a class. Like it's basically just the render method and that's it. This is called a stateless functional component, or functional component for short. It doesn't have any state, doesn't have any attributes, no methods, it's just HTML. So here we return So right now we're returning nothing, but if we go back to our jobs container, grab this, and paste it in here, just like Danny pointed out earlier, don't forget that style object. Now it belongs here, right? So keep on moving it around. Let's get that guy over here. So we're just moving pieces around. Now the problem, though, you may have caught are on lines 7 and 8. Right? We're referencing an object that's not in this component. Right? This will crash. This won't even work because we need to somehow get that data in there. Right? And that's happening through the props argument. Okay, so this data here will be passed in through the props. Okay, so we can just quickly, for convenience, just do that, right? So we don't have to change this around, or we can change it to props. It doesn't really matter, just pick one or the other. Right, but the important thing is when we actually use this component, how do we pass in those props? Like how do we transfer the data from point A to point B? So that's what we're going to do next. So before I get away from this, everyone have that? Okay. So inside the, where is it, jobs, we now have to import that. So what is that? Preview. Presentation. And that will go here, right? Oh, shoot, sorry. Right there. We just took out that chunk of code and put it in the presentation component, right? So here, we want to do that instead. Okay, that's much more appropriate architecture. But what have we not done? Pass in the jobs property. Otherwise, it won't render anything. So we do this. Not jobs, excuse me, job. This guy is being passed into here as a job. which will be received by the preview component in the props argument and then rendered the way we designed.
What's the 3 dots for again?
Okay, that's called a spread operator. Basically, something else I could have done is this. Okay, does that make sense? We pass in a title and a description, because that's what the component needs, right? A shortcut way of doing the exact same thing is what we do over here. So that's the shortcut way of doing that. The question is like, why would you do one versus the other? Well, a job might have like 30 attributes, right? So it might be like a million like lines or whatever. This is an easy way to get them all in there. Does that make sense? So let's try it out. Oh, I added a new component. So I'm gonna rerun Webpack. I don't really think I have to, but it's just a good thing to be safe about. All right, everything still works. How's it looking on your end?
Okay, ask a question.
Yep.
The props that get received by preview, does it, since we're doing that spread operator, does it get it as like a whole object with the same kind of
That's correct.
attributes?
It's like a one-to-one transfer. That's accurate. It can be confusing when you're passing in like multiple props. It gets a little confusing, but your question is correct. Anything else? Who has it working? Hands up. Okay. Where are you in terms of your React studies versus what we did tonight? Because you guys, most of you went to a boot camp, right? So have you learned these concepts already? Or are these, have you passed this stage of the React sort of progression? Yeah? So do you want to keep going? Yeah? So the next thing we can do, well, let me explain what would normally happen next. So there's a lot here I'm doing that's like for the sake of convenience. There's a lot of shortcuts I'm taking here to get through this within 2 hours, right? But a lot of it does violate best practice. Like for example, this API call should not be here. Right? This is very poor form in terms of architecture. This should be residing in a utility function where you can make the API call again and again and again somewhere else. Because if you think about it, in a more robust project, how many components are you going to have that's connected to the data? More than just one, probably 10, 15, or like 20, right? So you don't want to have the super agent call all the time in all these different components, right? Maybe you want to change the library. Maybe like Axios better, or Fetch, or whatever. That means you got to go through all the components and change them. That's terrible. So this should be inside of a utility library where you manage your API third-party libraries. And if anything ever gets deprecated or you want to move it out, you can just change that utility function. More importantly, this data right here, the state, it's pertinent to this component in particular, right? This component has its own state, and that's where we keep the jobs. Does that make sense? And this whole project is a jobs project, which means in all likelihood there are going to be other components that need the same data, most likely. I mean, it would be kind of strange if that didn't happen. So can you imagine the problem that's going to happen there? If you have like 7 components that all need this data, but they all make the API request individually inside their own state. You have all these different states being maintained for the same data. Can you kind of see where that becomes problematic? So here, if I add a new job here, and another component it renders that list of jobs, that component will not know about it because it'll have its own list. Does that make sense? And in doing so, we will have to create a mechanism to sync up those lists. We'll have to create like a pub sub notification system where if I create a new job, it broadcasts a notification to all the other components, and then it'll render with the new data, right? Or really, what's the correct way to solve this problem? Does anyone know?
Move the state.
Sorry?
You move the state.
Move the state where?
Somewhere higher up.
What would that be called? And you're on the right track.
I think in React they call it lifting the action.
What you're describing without realizing is you're describing Redux.
Redux.
That's the Redux store, which is the higher level of the state. It's kind of like the state of the entire project. So the question then becomes, we have to have a higher state. That's called the store, whereby we have to move this data to the store so that all other components can properly react to those changes. That's a very different way of looking at managing your projects. Does that make sense? Like, it's a very different way of looking at it. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is because right now, the problem is not technical, it's mental. Right? Understanding where to put data is really the problem. Putting data inside of arrays is easy. I mean, you should learn that in month 1 of your boot camps. Knowing where to put it is the key. So this is a very common mistake I see in React projects. In fact, in the past 12 to 18 months, I've had around 3 or 4 projects, like assignments, contract assignments, where my job was to clean up that mess, where people would set up all these components with their own internal state referencing the same data. That happens a lot. It's a kind of a weird, it's a weird use case of React. It's kind of like, why are you even using React? You're not really leveraging its power, right? Or Redux for that matter. So the reason I'm pointing that out is because it's a very common mistake, even for professional developers. What's happening is that people are coming from an Angular 1 background. It's not happening as much anymore, but Angular 1 used to be king of the hill. I'm guessing we all kind of knew that. Angular 1 is strongly MVC, Model View Controller. So the architecture I just described is Model View Controller, where all the components have their own state and they manage their own data. That's Model View Controller, where essentially this would be the controller, the model would be whatever's in here, and the view would be the render. Okay, that's the view, right? That's MVC architecture. Ruby on Rails is having MVC. It's like everyone knows MVC because everything teaches MVC. Python, Django, MVC. I did iOS for 5 years. That's MVC. It's all MVC, right? React is very, very non-MVC. It's a different way of looking at things. So, for example, it's a completely different paradigm. So what I'm trying to say is, like, we all speak English, obviously, right? English has a certain sort of structure to sentence language, like subject, verb, predicate. Is that right? Subject, verb. If you speak a completely different language, like a Korean language, for example, the whole structure is inverted. Everything is different, right? But if you go from English to French, it's kind of the same structure, just different like words for different things. But it's kind of the same structure. So the transitions are a lot easier. Well, going to React is like going from English to Korean or vice versa. Like the whole word, everything is just different. You have to like undo a lot of your education, right? So if you come from an MVC background, it could be a bit of a hindrance. It certainly was for me. If you're completely new to programming, that's kind of a good thing in this case, because it's such a different way of looking at your data that your preconceived judgment doesn't get in the way. Does that make sense? And for me at least, it got in the way because I did Angular 1 professionally for almost 2 years. I did iOS professionally for 5 years. Like MVC was like all I knew. So I made the mistake of treating this like MVC, and that led to a million problems for me. Luckily, I was able to make the adjustment. However, professionally, a lot of people still have not made the adjustment. So there's opportunity there, is my point. That's what I'm trying to articulate. There's opportunity there. Almost all my React jobs now are just cleaning up messes. I don't have any greenfield projects, like meaning like starting from scratch. What I do is I inherit a mess because they messed it up, and these are the problems I see. People putting data in the wrong spots because they're treating it like an Angular 1 project, amongst other things, but that's a very common mistake. So as it relates to you guys, the reason I'm even pointing this out is because, number one, don't make that mistake, right? Like, don't be that guy. Number two, try to be the guy who cleans that up, or the girl, excuse me, but try to be the programmer who cleans that up. You want to be the solution, the cleaner, right? Because if you're the guy the programmer who walks in afterwards and clean up all that mess, you establish real authority over this domain. You are a professional, right? You are the answer to problems. I still get phone calls from clients 12, 18, 24 months ago saying, this is a mess, I need you to help me out here. It happened today, it happened with the Python Django project. So what happened was, it's a Python Django backend with a React front end. And the Django guys, the Python guys, they're not getting this. They're not getting it. They thought they would, because learning Python from like Angular 1, it's a fairly seamless adjustment, because the concepts are the same, just the language is different. Well, here the language is different as well. ES6 versus ES5, and the concept completely throws people off. So it's really not practical to sort of be the answer guy, like first year out. But what I'm saying is these are the problems that I'm seeing over and over again. The industry is starting to show a lot of problems, patterns that I see over and over again, beyond the obvious ones like the guy's just a bad programmer, but even good programmers make mistakes within React Redux in the ways I'm describing. It's a very common thing. But yeah, so that's another thing I wanted to point out was what I'm doing here that I would not do in a professional environment, which is what you were pointing out. This belongs in a higher state. In a React Redux code environment, this would normally go through a sequence of what's called actions. And the actions would deliver this data to the store, the higher state. And then this data would inject the data into the store, and all the other components would update. All the components would react, not just one. Does that make sense? That's called the single source of truth. There's only one store for the entire project. And that's the Redux architecture. Did you guys get to Redux in your boot camps?
We just started to touch it
Okay.
this week.
Redux is where you separate. Like, that's where the wheat separates from the chaff. Like, that's where it's getting to a point with programming, especially on the front end, where it's no longer a matter of like being better at the same stack. There are people who just won't be able to do this. It's getting to that point. I've been doing these demos for 2 years. Like, I have enough frame of reference now to know that no matter how hard certain people try, they're not going to be able to do certain things. So what's happening is that the programming environment on the front end, ironically, because the front end used to be considered easy, now it's not. What's happening is that there's becoming a stratification on the front end to where being senior doesn't mean you're very good at what everyone else does. You know, like being a senior level athlete means you're in the Olympics. Being a recreational athlete like me means you can't do even half as good, right? If I can do 5 times as good, then I'm going to be elite level, right? However, here, that analogy does not maintain. The analogy is more like junior devs can't even do this. They're not capable. And then if you can get to, not this literally, I mean React Redux. If you can get to Redux and GraphQL and multiple state management libraries like Apollo and stuff like that, and you can do all that with like a real-time database, that's a senior level skill that mediocre developers will never be able to do. So what happened is, you know, it used to be senior devs are really good at Angular 1 and Node and Express, the mean stack. But junior devs just weren't as good at the same stack. Am I making sense? But what's happening more and more is that for the senior devs, they're just capable of a whole nother level of skill. That's certainly happening on the front end. And it's happening more and more. The tech world is really changing. I've been doing this 7 years. Every year it's like a doozy. Every year it's like, wow, I can't believe that happened in the past 12 months. Every year I'm thinking that, right? So it's very, very challenging. It's very hard. You got to keep up. To show you one quick example of where I apply this, practically speaking. Another very common mistake. This is worth pointing out. So here, a very common beginner impulse is to use React Redux everywhere. I call it overreacting. You're overreacting. You're overreacting. This is not a practical solution to the problem. You should not do that. it's a poor decision on several levels. Let me explain why. Here is my business. This is my startup that I run, right? If you notice, I don't use React here, right? Because this is a simple front end. I mean, even where I'm processing real data, like let's say I get here. I'm processing data from the back end, like I'm making API calls here, right? And I'm processing, there's some Ajax stuff going on here, but it's still non-React. Now, why would I do that? Because this is not a complicated front end. This is a simple front end. So if I want to hire someone to work on this, which I do, by the way, I'm not going to pay that guy $75 an hour to work on React Redux. Why would I do that? That's my money. It's my time, right? That would be a business foolish decision. Furthermore, if I did write this in React Redux, I'd have to maybe train someone up to get good at React Redux to do this. This is easy. This is jQuery. Like I don't need that level of talent for this. Furthermore, I'm not going to budget $75 an hour, which is the low end for a good React Redux guy, to work on this. That would be stupid. Right? That would be a bad business decision. Right? Very common beginner impulse in React Redux. Whereas once you go here, now we're back to React Redux. Here I'm processing a ton of data. I need React Redux here. It actually makes sense here. It's the right time to use it. So you want to be judicious about where to use it, right? And that's the mistake that the guy that called me today, his front-end devs use React Redux everywhere. So like, this guy's kind of stuck. Like he had to call me, right? So it's sort of a tough situation to be in, right? Well, I'm not going to put myself in that boat. The point is you want to make the right decision for the right time. So to every hammer, a problem looks like a nail, right? I think that's how the saying goes. To a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So that's another sort of React Redux manifestation in the industry that you should be aware of as a beginner, right? And if you want to be a contract dev like me, if you want to go into consulting like me, then you want to really prove or at least demonstrate that you understand the business implications of your decisions, right? You don't want to just be the guy who says, I'm really, really good at this. Like everyone says that. You want to say you can understand the business implications of why you're doing what you're doing. And if you can articulate that very well, at least as a consultant, that separates you. Full-time, I don't really know. I haven't done full-time, but for what I do, contract work, that goes a long way. Because everyone's budget conscious. Not everyone's Microsoft or Amazon. They're not going to put in $1 million for development, right? They have a budget they have to be aware of. So, yeah, that's it. There's a lot more I could have done, but it's getting kind of late, so I'll call it a wrap tonight. However, this will be on the tutorial section right here, probably this time tomorrow, as well as the code. So the code will be up as well, and the video, and that's pretty much it. Any questions, anything else you want to review, anything else you want to touch base on? No? All right, I'll do this again next week. Just check back on the meetup.